And thanks East LA. I grew up very nearby. Um, my first elementary school was in Monterey Park. I was born in the San Gabriel Valley. And I spent most, yeah, this shout out to the 626, which used to be the 213, but I actually kind of like that the 626 is more descriptive.
So I think that Orhan's introduction was great. Yes, we'll talk about design, but I think we want to talk about some other things that we have sort of learned over our our period of time in architecture. And we also want to talk about some things that have influenced us on this path. So we've broken the talk down into two categories, are sort of values of sort of what we've learned and what we think is important now. And so I think part of this is for you guys to take away that you can start now to figure out what those things are for you. And what our, some of our inspiration is so that you can also look around your community, your area, your world to find out what inspires you and start to kind of put it into little boxes and take it with you on your journey through this process.
Lectures are always difficult because it sounds like lessons, and it's really not. It's more hopefully a discussion, and we're not by any means solitary in this. Everyone basically has to sharpen their own tools. So this is just what has come about after looking back after, a long time of design work. So, these are our principles.
Well, and that's our principles now,
right?
And next year they will morph and change, and over 10 years, so it is a process, and it's not like this is all we think about.
Right.
But we chose some of the things that are important to us, kind of on a daily basis in our work.
Yeah. So go ahead and shout out if you don't like these principles. We have we'll
get you some more.
We have others.
We have a back pocket.
So
okay.
Balance, diversity. A lot of these things will go through. You want to do this?
Yeah. So I think one thing that has been, really kind of an amazing experience from our time as students through to where we are now was an ability to work with lots of different design disciplines very closely and collaborate. So it's, while we're both architects, we have backgrounds in product design and urban design and graphics and branding and interiors, so that we draw on all of our experiences every day to create a holistic solution. So whether we're working with other collaborators or ourselves, we always look to all of these disciplines to create a holistic solution.
So it's interesting when we talk about diversity and what it might mean as it applies to what we do. One of the things that we were taught when we were in school, and Bernard had some suspicions about that it wasn't a single religion, but the international style was an idea that tended toward uniformity. And so, and as the world has progressed since the word was invented, things like communications, global styles, technology, media, these have all trended toward uniformity. And there are why places like Berlin and Paris and London are starting to look the same, is because of the consequences of these kinds of connective tissues. On the other hand, things like art, culture, ecology, tradition, your religions, these tend toward diversity. These are the things that we explore, that what makes things specific versus uniform.
And part of that has to do with, how you start a design process and your analysis. And you look at place. So you look at, sort of the urban forms and natural systems and topography and all the things that are specific to a place. We also like to look at the things that are specific to the culture of the client, the community, whoever you're designing for. Because we believe that it's the marriage of those two things that make for a richer design.
Right, and we talk about place is about the physical construct of something, and culture is about the kind of ethos of the people that make it. And it's interesting to watch this cycle over time, how place makes a culture. Eskimo culture, for example, is an extreme example. And then how that culture makes place, how a belief system can create a building for worship, for example. So those two things cycle back and forth to each other.
We also have had a lot of fun working at completely different scales. And so on the left-hand side is sort of this kind of extra large kind of urban scale planning, really looking at things from, a mile high, versus on the far right, really looking at things that you can hold in your hands and things that are very intimate. We'll show you some examples of, things that touch your lips. And everything in between, honestly, in all the different disciplines that we showed you. So this idea that scale matters, and your design solutions change dramatically based on the scale that you're working with.
But your ethics and your approach could be shared among them. You don't start thinking differently just because of the scale of the object or environment you're working on. And this is just to name it. This was a master plan study on the left hand here for Cal Poly Pomona.
And a model that was crafted, which leads to your next.
Right. Oops. Sorry. We're advancing randomly now.
No.
Okay, there we go.
So we also want to, kind of shout out to the fact that our discipline is really about making, and again at those different scales, at the scale of your pencil and your sketchbook, and your hand, and I think Michael talked about collage at the last lecture. So this is an example of a sort of a three-dimensional box that we made, that we by hand, with these kind of packing peanuts and collage different things together to create a three-dimensional Joseph Cornell type box. But that we also think that making things digitally is also part of that. So it's not necessarily important what or how you're making it, but that you're actually doing it, and that's part of your process. So
making sure that people are seeing things move, because it's important as we go through this lecture. And just,
you saw that move.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
So this is the concept of making, and I think a lot of times people talk about making as if it has to be physical, has to be matter. Making is the making, and whether you're using Rhino or Photoshop, that you're crafting something regardless. You're creating a product with your eyes and your hands and your mind.
Okay, so those were the values that we were saying that we bring with us through whatever project, whatever design, and move forward. But we thought we'd use the lens of inspiration as a way to show some of the work.
And so the inspiration, and these are the, looking back, sometimes you do things intuitively, but I think it's important for us as designers, including you and us, not just me and Julie, but us as designers, to look back and understand what drove that retrospectively. And so a couple of the things, and there's probably more than this, but the ones we could put names to were this idea of extreme thought, the importance of beauty, life, abstraction, humility, and memory. And go ahead.
No, we're going to use some actual representation of those to express those ideas, and then include some projects with that.
So these are authors of that operate this way. Significantly, both Julie and I went through this group in Florence as we studied separately, didn't know each other until years later, but we had some of the same teachers. And Super Studio were kind of significant in the critique of the international style, because they saw the world creating uniformity, and so that they were testing ad absurdum ideas of the 60s, like, okay, if we keep going down this road, where will we end up? And so they would push things to, when we talk about extreme thought, they would push something to the extreme. And this shows up in some of our projects as well. If we keep doing this, where will it end up? in both good and bad ways. And so they proposed this idea, well, if the world is universal, then it needs a universal continuous monument. So this is their project called the Continuous Monument, which was a series of renderings, storyboards for a film about a monument that basically encircles the earth, taking this idea of universality to an extreme to see how it plays out. The other thing that was interesting about them was what were the things that were important in life that all cultures share, that you could boil off all the physical consequences of our existence and reduce ourselves down to the important events in our life. So life, education, ceremony, love, and death were the things. So I found it really interesting that these guys would say these things. And so when we were asked to do a garden, we started looking at, it was an experimental garden in Napa. And we were starting to think about how do people participate in rituals that create environments. And so there's this thing in Shinto and Buddhism where you tie prayers or wishes to a fence or a pole, and then sometimes those wishes are then burned so that the gods can hear or see them. And it's this way of transcending, taking a desire, giving it physical form, and then letting it transcend. So we came up with this idea for this garden up in Napa in a way, and this has this duality in the creative process of that moment where you're very private. You need to be very intimate. You don't want anyone to see your work. It's when you're kind of exploring your desires. And so we created these little changing rooms, these booths, where you would write your wish on these little plastic discs and then hang them on this other room, which was the manifestation room, the exhibitionist room. And by having a number of people write these wishes down, you could then create an environment that sometimes the wishes are mundane, and sometimes they're really significant. But by adding all of these wishes together, you start creating the tree. It's the opposite of a tree, that instead of losing its leaves, it gains them by the way that these wishes get attached to this. This was a kind of very low cost, temporary somewhat garden, and all landscape is somewhat temporary, and all architecture is temporary, and even our earth is temporary. But it was this idea of understanding over time how people can participate in the creation of a space.
So the next one, talking about beauty, and I think, I think we're more comfortable with it now. And I think
you didn't used to be allowed to say the word.
Form follows function. So I think, it's something that we've talked a lot about over the years. But I think, my feeling now in the culture is that beauty is acceptable and that we can talk about it. So looking at Andy Warhol and how he found beauty in the things that you would find in the grocery store, right? So whether it was these Brillo boxes or the Campbell's soup cans, that there are things around you in your environment that are beautiful, and you have to train yourself to look for them.
It makes the mundane special, and I think that's something we sometimes confuse exquisiteness and opulence for beauty, and in fact, we like to think that beauty exists along the entire spectrum, and Andy was a really good example of how you could find beauty in everything. And this a quote I found by him that I think stresses this, like, so we think that mass production can tend toward we don't want to argue against kind of mass production, and that everyone has a right to beauty. And I love this quote, that no amount of money can get you a better Coke than the one the bum on the corner is drinking. And I think that this is something that's really important, that it doesn't have to be exclusive. And that's where this idea of inclusivity and equality it starts to work its way into the kinds of projects that we've done. Just to be honest, we didn't start with this. We found that there were like minds out there, and that justified why we thought the way we thought, that we weren't alone. And sometimes I feel like in design, you're supposed to have the concept first and then derive from that. I think we found that we started working in a certain way and felt a little lost, and then started finding that there were other people that had been there before us and made us a little more comfortable about it.
So this is a school for LAUSD that we worked on many years ago, but it was kind of had a modular architectural component to it, but it was for kids who didn't know how to read yet. And so we looked to the neighborhood, so it's like Third and Benton area, to look at sort of what was the culture, how were they using these pictures to talk about what they were selling in their store. So the graphics are, you know, all over the neighborhood, very personal. Every store has their own way of painting things. But again, the products are mundane, but each one of the paintings is actually pretty amazing.
So the perfect example of how culture makes place. The way a culture sees things, the way a culture sells things, and the way a culture demonstrates what they're selling started creating this place. And so we thought it was important that the school be a product of that place. So we used the same technique of devising a mural or a series of graphic panels that could identify the difference in these buildings that had, for cost reasons, to be exactly the same, like tract houses. And that's nothing to be afraid of. Getting back to Andy's quote, that things can be mass produced and still be special. And so we figured out a way to make each of these mass produced buildings somewhat special.
So that, you know, if a child who doesn't know how to read knows that they're in the building with the sun, or they're in the building with the chicks. And then each one of those buildings was then customized around the graphic or the color scheme that went with it.
So another technique, the area, and I grew up in this environment. I grew up with this phenomenon of tagging, and I understand why it happens. I don't have a judgment about it necessarily, but the problem is that when it's important to maintain your buildings. We talk about maintenance later on. And that in the process of maintaining, even if you have the exact same paint can that you painted the building, the environment will change the color on the building, so the paint will no longer match. But in this case, we built that mismatch into the design, that each of the screed lines denotes a slightly different color paint. So even if you paint over the tag, eventually the pixelated pattern perpetuates itself.
And then we created sort of the amalgamation of all those graphics as an entry mural to introduce the school to the neighborhood.
I want to talk about this guy a little bit. This guy was really influential. He's not very well known in the United States. He's also not very well known in Italy anymore, but he was really significant as an experimenter of design. Since the 40s until the 90s, this guy was pushing the envelope. And I think what's important for him is how he kept bringing it back to what it was like to be alive, what it was that you viscerally reacted to. The way music makes your hair stand up on your arms or on the back of your neck sometimes, it's reaching across media to somehow enter your ears and make you feel a certain way. And this guy operated that way. The other significant thing he did was change the value system. And if an aesthetic is going in a certain direction toward conformity, and it is considered beautiful to do that, two things you can do. You can play to that music, or you can change the value system upon which that music is judged. And I think he did this over and over again, where he asked us to look at things that were slightly different than what we were conventional. What was important about a series of experiments he did to do this, bringing this back to life, was these series of experiments that he did in the desert, where aesthetics in the 70s had gotten really conformist. And so he, like the Super Studio guys, he went a little bit the other way. Instead of pushing something to a logical extreme in terms of extreme thought, he pushed it the other way. What are the fundamental things that we do to create environments? And so he designs this floor upon which your steps will be uncertain by stringing wire over string over a ditch. I think what's important about this, getting back to this question of making, this could be a drawing, it could be a collage, it could be an idea. This guy actually goes out to the desert and builds things. This is what we do. We don't leave these things on paper. We don't leave them in our minds. In some ways, what we do is make the invisible visible and habitable. That is, you can get inside these spaces. Another fundamental question, do you want to look at the wall or do you want to look at the valley? This is a user choice sometimes, and sometimes it's a designer's choice. So these are the questions you deal with on a very simple level. But he doesn't just leave it at that. He says, I'm going to take this chair, I'm going to take this little black canvas, I'm going to make this statement as a physical space. If you were an illustrator, you would do this as a drawing. If you're an architect, you do it as an environmental piece. So this gets me to this other question of relationship. I love that most of us can identify with people in our families or our friends or places that we've been where this question of relationship and empathy, the ability to feel someone else's feelings, is in fact the first step of design. It's where you put yourself not in the program, but in the potential users, both inside the project and the users that might walk by it that are not part of the project. What's it like to be all of those people is an important part of the first step of design. It's identification. Relationships are the way that we do that. And I like this image because we all know more or less. I tried to find an image that, like, I have not seen Harry Potter, right? So I couldn't use a Harry Potter. Everyone else but me has seen the Harry Potter films. I had to find an image that everybody could understand. What I think is important about this image is there's 16 potential relationships in this one image. 2 of the things in this image are products. 2 of them are actually related, although they don't know it in this scene necessarily. The interesting thing is that they each have individual and collective relationships with each other. Princess Leia has a relationship with R2-D2, and Luke has a relationship with C-3PO. C-3PO has a relationship with R2-D2. There's this complex relationship. And I think it's important that we don't merely draw the boundary between the pair, but we draw the boundary, we draw lines that include all 4 of these things. And we have relationships with products, we have relationships with environments. It's not just a person that causes these things. I'm going to run through all this. So there's a whole series of things here that have to do with our responsibility and our interaction with, and it mostly has to do with objects. It's easier if you think of these next slides in terms of objects that are near and dear to you, but they also apply, they map ideas from the relationships we have with people. They map them to inanimate objects, of which environments are inanimate objects. But you can have these relationships, and we think after this, in terms of our inspirations and our values, that these things are important. There's 3 ways we relate to objects: character, consummation, and caretaking. And it's a cycle. For example, in character, what is the collective memory of the object? Where does it come from? Most significantly, it's easy to understand who gave it to us. What does it mean that someone gave you something? And now the importance of that object is not the object, but the relationship of the person that gave it to you imbued in that object. Simple things like, how is it worn? That gives it character.
This ring is my grandmother's.
Yeah. I still have the drafting pencil my father gave me from high school. This is a whole series of images, some of which you might recognize, that have to do more with their meaning. And I get in trouble for using this word, almost as much trouble as I got into by using the word beauty when I started using it. But I get in trouble with this word meaning, but I do think that things mean something. And so, for example, Andy Warhol's boxes, we know what those are. The ruby slippers from The Wizard of Oz. Rosebud is the entire premise of Citizen Kane. And it has 2 scenes, 2 shots, the beginning and the end. We understand what drove Orson Welles' character in Citizen Kane because of his attachment to the sled. So this next relationship you have with the machine is consummation. Like, how do you relate to it? What is the sensory exchange? In this case, it might be easiest to think of a musical instrument. If any of you are musical at all, you become part of the instrument. A guitar or a violin especially is something that becomes part of your body in some ways. Laurie Anderson, another very influential person because of her critique of culture and some of her extreme thought, invented a whole series of violins. But here you start to wonder, as a musician, where does she begin and where does the machine begin? Anybody that rides motorcycles knows this, that there are certain things the thing will expect you to do, and it can't do them without you, and you can't do them without it. And that there's this symbiosis that happens. Avatar is another really good example of how this shows up in film. This other relationship of maintenance. This is how you you form a continual relationship with something by taking care of it? Do we have a responsibility to take care of it? Who do we owe it to? Someone gave it to us or we acquired it. Who gets it after us? How do we ensure its longevity? How does it communicate its needs? How do you know that your car needs oil when it starts to smell a certain way? So for a while, I'm really into cars. For a while, I didn't have one to work on. So this is what I did to a stove. But this stove was given to me by the people that introduced me and Julie to each other. This is Ming Feng's stove of Hodgetts and Feng. Not only that, it's Ming Feng's mother's stove. And so this is not just the stove in some ways, so I owe it to do this to it.
But it's important to realize at the scale of architecture that in particular where we are right now in Europe, that things change over time and you have to take care of them. You know, thinking about the beginning of the Louvre, which is that box number 1, that through a process of addition and change, and then, you know, all the way up to the pyramid, that someone took care of this place and it didn't tear it down to build something new, right? It incorporated it and kept going.
There's a great sense of responsibility, but also the permission of agency in this process. So you're allowed to do this.
So the idea, you know, staying on objects for a while, that we started this company called Not Neutral many years ago, and it was kind of sort of housewares based. And in around 2010, Intelligentsia asked us to look at designing some new cups for them. They had already been selling some of our stuff. And Frank had, when he had worked in Italy, had worked on the sort of iconic Illy cup with Matteo Toon. And so, you know, we said, sure, let's give it a try. And so really thinking about what is it that makes the experience? What is it that, you know, what is it like to hold something? What is it like to drink something? And this is where we get into the kind of that issue of intimacy. So this is a diagram of where your sensory, where most sensory aspects of your body are. So your tongue and your lips have way more sensory sensitivity than your toes. So really thinking about, you know, if you're holding something, you're putting it to your lips, and you're tasting something, that is such an intimate experience that we really thought about how you actually use this thing culturally, but also physically, and how you hold it and sip from it. But at the same time, we thought, what is the dialogue that you have with the object? We talked about before, like, you know, someone's going to serve you a coffee, you have the coffee, what do you do after you have the coffee? How does the barista pour the coffee? How does it work as an object for them? We did lots of testing, and you can see the cups up on the left, 3D printed. So we went from sketching to 3D analysis to 3D printing to testing out how coffee was poured into it. And it's a big cycle of things that triangular shapes don't work, we now know. But latte art and how you pour milk into a cappuccino sort of is the physics behind that, make the form on the inside. And then that experience sort of moved into other types of coffee drinks, other types of materials for us, which we thought was interesting, using glass. The Gibraltar, they think, comes from Spain as a drink, and it's a coffee with less milk that is often served in a really cruddy bar glass. And so we designed a new glass for that had really different characteristics. It had a really great inside shape for pouring the milk into, so it had better fluid dynamics. It had a really nice lip feel. Again, putting something up to your lip, what is that like? The weight of it, how you held it, the thermal mass, did it keep the coffee warmer than the bar glass did? And then we kind of grew that system from espresso to the cortado to a cappuccino to a latte, working in glass. And using color. You know, it's amazing how coffee looks in a pink glass versus an amber or a black, changes the experience.
You know what it is?
Yeah.
So then we thought, okay, we're really good at this. We can make coffee cups that are perceived by some of the most retentive aesthetes out there, baristas. And so we thought, we'll do the same thing for tea. Somebody came to us and said, well, you've done this for that last mile of espresso. Can you do it for tea? And we thought, well, yeah, no problem. Well, tea has slightly different behavior. It rolls off the edge as opposed to holds the fluid in. This is one of our design discussions. There's a number of people that we still keep in touch with, that, you know, you can see the number of iterations, you can see the history, you can see the tests on the drawing, the printed tests of what this might look like. And we thought, okay, we'll just 3D print one and send it out and have a mold made, and we get it back in ceramic. And oh my God, it was the ugliest thing we have ever made by far. And I think everyone has already, if you've done your first week of design, you know this process. You think you know you're going to do something, and you do it, and sometimes it's the day before it's due, and you probably should have done it a few days earlier because you hadn't counted on the fact that you would hate it. And so then you have to go through this process like, oh God, what do we do? What do we do? And so this is an example of where extreme thought said, okay, if it's ugly, and Ettore Sotas, when I talked about him changing the value system, of saying, okay, if it's ugly, can I make it wider? Like, is the problem is that it's flared, it just flared. Well, maybe it needs to flare more instead of less. The reason we like the espresso cups was they were nice and tight and compact. They didn't flare, but the tea needs to flare. So we flared it and we're like, ooh, that does not do this shape justice. And so we went back to the drawing board and started saying, can we push that flare even farther? So this is a polyester print of the kind of quote unquote Mad Hatter version from Alice in Wonderland. Can we shove this thing so far over? And it's surprising how quickly that worked. Like pretty much everybody in the studio was, never thought that would have worked, but it did. These are the molds that when we got involved in making this stuff, a lot of designers work for a house and then the house makes stuff, but we ended up making, you know, sourcing our own materials, producing, finding the factories, doing all our own inventory. Julie was responsible for a whole business that did this, and growing the line to go ahead.
Well, no, so at the end of the day, the cup then, you know, had, because it had intentionality, I think, about it, that because we had really explored making it as dramatic as possible, that the lines became very crisp, and that it started, you know, then it was like, okay, now we're on to something that's really quite beautiful. And so we moved into working on the teapot itself. And so thinking about, okay, what are the things from the coffee cup that went to the teacup, and then what are things from the teacup that are going to influence the teapot? But now the teapot does something completely different, right? It has to pour. It's not about sipping, it's about pouring. And so how the handle is very straight on the teacup and then it swoops down, but on the teapot, it needs to angle a little bit so that when you hold it, you have a good balance for how the water is sitting inside of it. So it's kind of this thing that morphs from one thing to another, and the design changes, but they feel like they're related to each other. And so we extended that even to include a little sugar and cream that, so sort of like a mama bird and two baby birds, you know, so you started all the way back at espresso, and now you've got this thing, that these three little pieces that belong together.
So a lot of times as designers, especially as architects, we talk about objects, and as a product designer, you can think that it's fundamentally about objects, but I want to go back to this word relationship, because not only were we talking and learning about the relationship of the cup to our lips, as we made these objects, they had to start having relationships to each other. Mm-hmm. And they're not identical, they have a relationship to each other. Go ahead.
Oh, so this is a concept that I think, you know, we talk about every day. And Mary Blair was a Disney artist, and she is just like so influential to us in the way she abstracted historical pieces in It's a Small World, right? This is Alice in Wonderland here, but looking at the piece behind it. And so we were in Florence about a week and a half ago, and looking at the Duomo, the church that sits in the center of the city, and its baptistry. And we looked at this, the side of it, kind of taking away the rest of the context, and thought, oh my goodness, like there's the building is almost more of a graphic than a building, and they've abstracted the idea of windows and arches, because there's only 3 windows here, but you get all these other arches and things that could be windows that are just boxes. And it just kind of, you know, thinking about it with this example in front of us, like, wow, that, you know, this is an idea, abstraction is an idea that people have
from the first
have
cave,
always been doing.
from
Yeah.
the first cave paintings. So, you know, we thought, oh, Mary Blair is so creative because it's for a World's Fair, and she has to abstract somewhat stereotypically all the world's cultures into 2D art that can be reproduced quickly and restaged. And that's the ride that became It's a Small World, was this abstraction of a World's Fair experience. But the technique exists forever, and it does tie you to this long legacy. The other interesting thing about abstraction is it allows projection. So I've been through It's a Small World. I cannot tell anyone how many times. And that moment in your teens when that earworm will not get out of your head about that stupid song, where you hate It's a Small World for a while in your life, but you can project into it so many different times in your life because it is abstract. It allows different readings over multiple visits. This is some of her artwork in the production of that, and you can see how she can capture the environment so simply and allow, you know, so much of that projection that this is a really horrific mishmash, but I love this image and I love this space. That I am in the place from which these forms come right now. The irony or coincidence that Julie and I are actually in the land that these things are in, but they're sometimes richer because I can allow myself to project myself into this space in Southern California.
So this project really took that idea of abstraction again to, you know, pretty far, and it's a park, quote unquote, in Glendale for a chess community, and they did not have a space to gather and play in, but there was this alley that led from a parking structure to Brand Boulevard. And so the hope on the city's part was to make a space for the chess playing community that would be comfortable for anybody walking through it, and be a front sort of entry, front gate to Brand Boulevard.
What's interesting about this is that if you do site analysis, you're only going to come up with stuff that's in this picture. But if you go after a certain time of day, you see people playing chess. And that activity is just as important. Those people are just as an important part of the site analysis. And in this case, as inspiration and as form making, the analysis of the community was more important than the analysis of the space.
Yeah, pretty bland space.
Right, but it's a game that can be played without language. That is, everyone more or less follows the same rules. You don't even need to speak another person's language to play chess with them.
But also looking at the forms of chess over its history, and that was an inspiration for how we would move forward in the design process.
So we did a study of a bunch of what we thought were fairly easily buildable totems in the space that would tell people walking through the day that this was a quote unquote chess park, but that these totems all had different utilities. The rook was a place to store things because it was the castle. The bishop was an announcement place. The king was buried in the center, well protected, but it was a place to tell stories from. The throne was a place to tell stories from. So these are more or less architectural drawings of the actual pieces. And this is how they were laid out in the place. The knight is guarding the garage because the garage is 2 steps over and 1 step down. And so that's how a knight moves, that it's positioned in a way, not that this is a checkerboard space, but that the movements of the pieces were as important as the pieces themselves. The other thing we found was if we built all of these pieces as architecture, we could only afford one of the towers. And an example of a little bit of abstraction, but also of this idea of extreme thought, that if we, and sometimes I talk about thinking like a criminal, and I mean that in the best way. But if I think of this as a building, it will cost me this much. If I think of it as a sign, we could afford all the pieces and we didn't change a single detail. It was really just thinking about how to make it, what route to take, not necessarily changing what it was made of. And so there's this guy named Richard Carlson, who is a signage and fine art fabricator. I think he was in Glendale at the time. And so we went to him and we said, you know, if we build this with foundations and framing and steel and lighting and all those different trades getting involved, it's going to, each of those trades has their own way of doing things. Can we make it all at once in a shop? Because they're basically small enough, like signs, to be built in a shop. And this is Richard standing next to the upside down Queen's crown. And these are the pieces in his backyard, built as single objects. And the thing I loved the most was they were literally placed like chess pieces onto. They were fully fabricated, and a crane came out and dropped the pieces like it was making the first moves onto the site. And this is, you know, you could call it cleverness, you could call it thinking like a criminal, you could call it evasion, but sometimes the problem is not the design. Sometimes the problem is thinking of the process of it. And that requires sometimes just as much creativity as visualization.
So here they are in place, lit up, because the chess community really plays late into the night. And so seeing everyone in the space around the tables, watching, playing, and creating a space that is light and bright, but dynamic, and really telegraphs through to everybody, day or night, what the place is about.
So the culture here made the place. Do you want me to talk about it?
Yeah.
I'll do humility. Surprising. It'll be very ironic. But there was this other thing about, you know, I think Julie and I worked before we actually had, you know, degrees. We worked during school. And so there's this aspect of, you know, making and just, you know, starting out very, very small, and understanding your role as a designer is sometimes very, very small, and you don't have great budgets. And it's important, I think, to be humble about that process and not denigrate the client for not wanting to spend more, and not throwing your hands up and like, oh, they can't afford my design, you know, my vision will never be realized. I think sometimes it's helpful to say, okay, what do we have to work with? What can we do with it? There was this movement in the 60s called arte povera, because of the commodification or the tendency of art to, you know, really start getting expensive at a certain point. Similar to what Warhol was doing with comics, where Lichtenstein was doing with comic strips and Warhol was doing with packaging. There was a group looking at just found materials and can we make art out of found materials? This is Mario Merz and his partner at the time, Marissa Merz, using foil and sticks to try to create things that, you know, you could have a debate about. I think they're beautiful, and I will defend the fact that they're beautiful. They are absolutely art. They are made out of off-the-shelf items. From the land of Frank Gehry, this is not an unknown concept to us, that art can be made out of humble things. This is an artist named Tadashi Kawamata. I had a personal relationship with him because I thought he was homeless and he was building this little shelter, and I kept telling him that there was going to be an art show here soon and they were going to tear down his little shelter. And then he showed up at the opening and I'm like, oh my God, I am so embarrassed. What an arrogant dork I am. You are absolute artist and I am the dork. But we, you know, we still learn lessons to this day about how just random scraps of wood can be turned into art. So we had the fortune of having to test this out on ourselves, like some scientists who can't get funding.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So this lovely little piece is a bungalow that Abbot Kinney's in Venice as part of what Abbot Kinney envisioned of Venice in America.
Venice, USA.
And so you can see on the right is a bungalow that looks like it's in better shape than this one. In fact, it's about the same, but really kind of thinking about what a small house is. And Michael talked about, you know, some of the houses in his lecture about being on really small pieces of property. And I was like, oh, ours is only 35 feet wide and 80 feet long. And so how do you take a bungalow and make it into a house for your family, but also keep the character of the neighborhood?
So talking about your own house is a little bit like trying to explain your pajamas to people. So don't take more from this than we might intend. You know, this is just how we as a pair of architects could afford a piece of property, buy a little shack and do what we could with it. Trying to keep this aspect of humility in it. So I think
so it's important to note that we did 2 renovations to it. The first one, which you'll see, but then we added on to it. And so this version of it is the second iteration. And this piece that you're seeing is sort of on the opposite side of the original bungalow. And we would live on a walk street, so it's an alley in the back.
Yeah, the part of modernism is about sleight of hand. And one of the things I did like about modernism was early Mies about being honest about the materials, honest about the structure. And so we were calling this paleo modern by using really, really raw kind of materials, but in a truthful way. Each of these sticks is actually part of the lateral system that's resisting seismic loads. They're cantilevered out of a stone wall. You can see a little bit in the drawing on the left. The other thing is that they're related in terms of place to a very large, more than 80-year-old Magnolia grandiflora. So we really saw the importance of the tree in relationship to the house, that this was a kind of tree house. So this is a drawing, and again, in the act of crafting, you know, we still love hand drawing. And there's something about the accidents of doing things by hand or randomly by computer that yield a kind of quality and desire very kind of deftly. It captures things that can't be captured. Gesture, I guess, is the thing that shows up. And so with the gestures of these timbers became very important. And how they act as a screen. And you can see here, like not unlike the first treehouse me or Julie built when we were younger, before we knew each other. And how there's a kind of natural, honest randomness to the timbers that is maybe more modern than modern in terms of the fact that they're very honest about their orientation.
So yeah, you can see the tree in the back. And you know, one of the great things about this system is that it allowed us to use the glass sort of floor to ceiling, or in this case on top of the CMU wall, but that there were no other walls. It was just glass, the floor, the glass, the roof.
Normally you'd be required to have, this is getting into structures, but a shear wall, but we replaced a shear wall with a series of cantilevered timbers. So each of these timbers is actually structural and acts as a sunscreen.
That's looking back towards the alley. And then I think that what you saw there and here is that we started to kind of think about the wood members that are on the outside of the house, and how could we bring some of the humble quality of that wood to the inside. And so looking at plywood, which is a very simple, ubiquitous material, but it's honestly so beautiful. And looking at the pattern of it compared to a stone pattern. So we took that material from the bedroom upstairs, brought it down downstairs and into the rest of the house, and tried to just keep things very simple. We used a black concrete floor, very simple wood ceiling, and then these plywood elements really highlighted the nature of that material.
ACX plywood with a flat finish.
So if I'm the part of the house that you're seeing with the chimney here, this was mostly part of our first foray into the house, and the part in the back was the part that we added later. My mother bought the house next door, so we were able to actually open up into the property. So there's 2 properties that sit next to each other, which really changed the configuration on the interior of the house. But it kind of all still ties together, and all of the house is really built around that tree.
So the other thing that's interesting about this, I didn't know what this space was in the middle, and there's a whole series of porches. Venice used to be a very pedestrian, it still is a pedestrian street. Porches are a really fundamental part about how people relate to each other in a residential kind of civic space. What's we call this our innie porch because it goes in instead of out.
Okay, moving on to memory. This is kind of something, it just sort of happened that Frank and I both had this kind of inspiration and kind of long history with the artist Giorgio de Chirico and how he represented the memory of things three-dimensionally as these kind of urban allegorical paintings.
He's one of the first people that talks about, well, he invented metaphysical art. He was pre-surrealist. He kind of didn't like the surrealists so much because they were doing things just to deliberately be weird. He was looking for what he thought were fundamental forms that all humans have in their mind, like all children know how to laugh without being taught, that there are some things that might be shared pre-linguistically. And so he's looking for those. And he's also messing with scale a little bit. So a lot of like what we are interested in is that the unanimity of scale, that an object can exist at multiple scales. And so you can see him here in his studio where the easels actually start showing up in the paintings. And that leads to an architect that was active when we were both here in Italy in our education, a guy named Aldo Rossi, who starts experimenting with metaphysical architecture in the same way, looking for forms that exist before you're conscious of culturally infused forms. And he turns these into these kind of scaleless, almost, in the Art Deco was a movement that did this as well, is that the object can exist at any scale. And there's a kind of denatured primacy to them, not unlike modernism, that we might think of these as postmodern because of when they arose, but in fact, they are not unlike modernism is in that they're looking for a root, non-definitive kind of reading. There are multiple readings in this, not one singular reading.
And then I love that he took those kind of urban things and turned, really thought about them at the scale of product. So is it a building? Is it a coffee pot? They both share some of the same elements. And the objects that he made, I thought were equally fascinating to the drawings.
So the significance in a building that we ended up doing for our third office. We had an office for a while called Rios Clementi Health Studios. We founded it Julie mentioned it, as an interdisciplinary office. And we grew quite large. In midway through its growth, we needed to design we found a building we needed to move into. And it was this mishmash. And it was very definitive in the kind of Whitman sampler, See's chocolate sampler of all these architectural styles. And like that little hovel house that we bought, and this is an advice that probably works for anybody who's operating on the architect of a young on the budget of a young architect, to buy your own place, buy the ugliest thing on the worst piece of property, because what you do is you leverage your vision and your ability to do that. Not just me, but all of you can do this. So we thought, there's no way we're moving into this. We told the guy who showed us, you got to be insane. You cannot put an architecture office in this. We'll be laughed out of town. But then we saw this, I don't know if you can see where my mouse is, but just above the car, there's a little piece of beam that's sticking down. And that thing told us that this was not a bearing wall building, that there was a beam there that was supporting these things. And so we asked a little bit if we could poke some holes, and we realized that in fact, if we took the skin off this building, and this again is a little bit the inspiration of a car on a frame, that the problem was only skin deep. And that there's this car called the Superleggera, which and the Porsche 917, which used a tube frame with a skin over it just to perform the aerodynamics, but the structure was actually coming from the tube frame underneath. We're like, okay, can we do that here? At the same time, again, through the process of site analysis, sometimes site analysis is gone by the time you get there. The thing you need to find has already been erased. On this site, before this building, was a water ballet school. And
So Esther Williams swim movies in the 30s and 40s,
Yeah.
all the way to the 50s, maybe.
So it's near Paramount Studios.
So this is where they would teach you how to do that fancy movie
Dance,
swimming.
water dancing.
Water dancing.
And so we started looking at this, the importance of water and how it could be resurrected on the site. How could we bring back the culture that was once here? And so we looked at the ripples and then designed this pattern. And if you know The Little Mermaid, Ariel's dad is Triton, sometimes known as Neptune. But we started looking at pictures of Triton, how we could make them. You could barely start to see a face in both full face and in profile on both sides of this image. And then we took that and created this idea of these looking at the reflectivity, the colorlessness. Someone once said, oh my God, your work is so colorful. And I had this feeling like I had used all the crayons or something. And so right at that moment, we started saying, well, could we do a building that's all about the colors around it, like water, that is reflecting all the water. So this is those of you know that the Gamble House know the story of the sleeping porches. And this was like these working porches that we attached to the side of the building. The interesting thing about silhouettes is a three-dimensional object casts the same shadow. It still casts a two-dimensional shadow. So if we made a two-dimensional object, we could cast a two-dimensional shadow in the same way. So this on the left is a study of a laser jet cut version of it, and on the right was the installed piece as a water jet cut version.
But more than just the screen itself. And I think, again, it's aluminum, so it has a reflectivity to it. We then decided that the glass that was above the base would be a mirrored finished glass to reflect the environment around it. And during the day, I think the screen helps provide a bit of privacy. The offices are on the second floor. There was a restaurant on the ground floor and retail, so that there's a sense of privacy during the day. But well, I think, did we have the photo at night? We'll get to it. But the privacy that you got from the screen let airflow through, made it an actual porch that you could inhabit. And you can see here the porch that before was very narrow and not actually usable. None of the windows opened onto it. And so now the porch was incorporated into the kind of mirrored glass box.
And you can see that beam that was the first signal. It's present in both of these images. On the right, it's been
exposed,
stripped.
And then left all the steel that we had found exposed on the inside.
Julie's in this picture.
The porch was on the right. And then at night, it changes into a completely different thing as it's backlit. So the beauty of mirrored glass, when used judiciously and properly, is pretty amazing. Okay, so we're on to our last thing we want to talk about. And again, and I really can't state that whole issue of the humble as it meets memory, that people come to you different points and you have to meet them where they are. If they have a problem in a design that you can help them with, that doesn't have a huge budget, that's okay. You can work within that. So Self-Hub Graphics, which I hope that you guys have heard is in East LA, and they were an offshoot from a nun that worked with Sister Carita, and basically started Self-Help Graphics to help the community through art deal with issues having to do with displacement and politics and a lot of other things. And they're basically saying, we have this building that we bought, which is great, and we have this parking lot. And really what we want to be is a park. Like, we want to be a space where community can come and be with us for many different types of things. And all we have is this parking lot. What can we do? So the site is at First and Anderson. It's right at that Pico Aliso Metro stop, and there's a high school right across the way. And I'm, kind of always pitching, like, if you ever want to just go in and see what they're doing, they're like a really great community organization. Is open to everybody, and I encourage you to go and see what they have to offer. And they not only do they help make screen prints, help you to learn how to do screen printing. They have festivals. They help people with skills for workforce development. They have all these murals on the outside of the building, and really a lot of events. And so please check them out. That's my pitch for that. But we were working to help them put together a grant proposal to get money to turn the site into a park. And so we were working with landscape architect Samantha Harris to figure out what this parking lot needed to be from a programmatic standpoint, but also looking at the memory or the history of the site and the area around it. And so the site's pretty close to the LA River, and the community group that, there's a number of different groups that are sort of call self-help home, but some of the Tongva people are part of that community. And so we met with them, we talked to them about, this space. This is sort of this idea that you want to involve as many people as possible and really try to figure out what the community needs, not what you want to give them, but what do they really need. And through that process, Samantha discovered this tree that was nearby. It was called the El Aliso tree, and it was there for a very, very, very long time, and things changed all around it. The picture on the right sort of shows the tree. It was a marker, a central place of gathering for the community over a very long period of time, and now the tree no longer is there. So taking the idea of the history of this tree, it was a sycamore, and trying to bring that back to the site, to kind of ground it in what the site had been when it was more natural and open, before the city grew up around it. And using the idea of that tree in the parking lot. We're proposing to put 4 of them in there, so that it starts to create a bit of a green space. But more than that, thinking about all the different areas of the site and how we could help tie the building to the site. So it wasn't just a parking lot and a building. Then I think a lot of our work talks about the connected nature of indoor and outdoor, and that we try to blend those boundaries, as Frank talked about that any porch. You don't know if you're inside or outside. And so thinking about different spaces in the site as different gardens, and they all have very different qualities to them. And through a process of working with the community, each one of these gardens is going to have its own idea about it.
I think there's an important piece here in how both Samantha's drawing on the right and Julie's drawing on the left draw inside space and outside space. There's not a distinction that you might know of the Noli map, which was a way of drawing Rome where all the inaccessible spaces, including walls, but not the insides of churches, which are accessible spaces, but your apartment is essentially a wall to anybody else. So it was drawing all the accessible, quote unquote, public spaces, whether they're inside or outside, as white spaces, and all the
drawing the public spaces as colored.
Right.
And
in this case, they're colored, but in the Noli plan,
okay.
they're white. Yeah. So I think it's often that we see landscape architects are conditioned, not that they're ignorant. It's the way that we're taught is to think only of the outside. And as architects, we're only taught of thinking from the threshold in. And having worked for 30 years with landscape architects, not only getting a sense of how time is a part of design, but that space is space. And whether it's inside space or outside space, you draw it the same if you want it the same. And so where the 3 is an indoor space, completely enclosed. But we think of it in the idea, both in Samantha's drawing and in Julie's drawing, we think of them as the same kind of space. It's the distinction, whether it's landscape or architecture, is insignificant.
And so ultimately the grant was submitted, and we're all sitting waiting, keeping our fingers crossed. But the idea that kind of radical thought to begin with, that you want to turn a building and a parking lot, the whole thing, into a park.
Not just the park, that's just the parking lot. The building is a park.
The whole thing is a park, and it's just like, wow, okay, what a great idea. Let's try, let's go. And we even are working to get an alley that's been vacated, include that. That's where number 5 is, this kind of alley garden. So I think that one last thing that kind of ties everything together.
So we're going to end on this one thing, which is the name of the talk. And we talk a lot about making and getting our own hands dirty and figuring out the problem at the level of cash register when you're starting to open an espresso or a housewares store, to really understand that making is the entire process, and making as a tool for fabricating memory. And like, it occurred to me that we've been making things with our hands, models and drawings, and as a way of making buildings or spaces or memorials. And then I thought of this thing, that the relationship between your mind, your hands, and your eyes, and that your mind forecasts for your hands, but your eyes are like snitches. They rat out whatever it is your brutish hands are trying to get past your gullible mind. That sometimes your hands can make something that your mind will go, yeah, that's what I wanted. But your eyes will go, no, no, no. Have you checked this thing out? It's ugly. You got to get engaged here. So your eyes are talking to your mind, and then your mind has to get re-engaged and look at what your hands made and go, no, that's not right. That critical thinking, that critical evaluation, this cycle, that's why the making is important. It's where the thing becomes physical and you can actually evaluate it. The act of making, along with the resultant artifact, the thing that you've made, that's the piece that reconciles your mind with your eyes. That those 3 pieces don't have a loop unless that object gets made, unless your hands made them. And what I mean is not physical artifact. Matter matters, but anytime you do something and print it out and look at it, or look at it on your screen, or put on a headset and look at it in VR space, you're evaluating. That's when your eyes start snitching on your hands. And that's an important part. You have to make that thing for your eyes to be able to rat your hands out. So
or to say, yeah, I got it.
Yeah, he did that really well. Give him a cookie.
Okay, that's it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frank and Julie. And I know that this time, are you guys going out to a dinner or cooking or what?
Oh, I cook almost every.
What's for dinner?
I don't know. We had a big lunch.
Well, hon, you don't want me to get into it. It's ridiculous how good the food is.
Let's do it. Well, really, I mean, thank you for this really beautifully put together lecture, very concise and very clear. Your all your points. Follow up on those, and I know both of you do the talk, but you both are very capable of doing the walk. So that's like a big thing for me, at least, and I'm sure the students had a chance to see that a pair of architects that has still, after all those years, after all that business, still capable of keeping their ideals alive. I always saw that in both of you, and I'm a really big appreciation for that. For both of you as a specific, Smith, Clementi, and I congratulate you for foraying into this. Just two of you now, and people as an office, and I wish you the best. We have time for a couple of, we'll talk when you come back. I'm sure we'll run into each other, and either in your juries or somewhere else. Do you have time for a couple, 3 questions? Okay, thank you. Anybody in the audience, if you have any questions, please raise your voice, unmute yourself. You can do that. You know, I'm a kind of a liberal Zoom guy. And or you can just type it in the message board, chat board, and I'll read it for you. So let's see if any of you have any questions for Julie and Frank.
Brian has his hand up. I'm really, my whole job now is looking at Zoom to see who wants to talk next. So thank you for using the little hand.
She's an insane design manager. Like you have no idea the team we're working with on a project we can't talk about.
Okay,
Yes,
Brian, you're on.
Thank you guys so very much for coming and doing this for our department and our university. We're so very proud of what's going on. I'm probably one of the youngest, one of the older students in the department, and I have benefited from these lectures time and again. I also work with my partner. We have a small little kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of like a design experience type thing where we work with high schools a lot and small production companies. I've been in entertainment since I was a teen. And I've been studying architecture for the last several years, trying to advance, make the bean even bigger and put more in as much as possible, and explore all the different facets. But I too work with my beloved. And can you guys speak to the dichotomy of that? There are days when you want to
Julie to talk about it.
I know there are days you want to tear your head off. You guys are in disagreement, but there've got to be other days where it's just like bang, bang, bang. The clicking is so unreal and natural. Yeah. And could you just minutely, I know you want to go into detail, but just minutely speak to that.
Well, I think, after we met at an architecture office together, and then, sort of moved together through all these different processes. But I do, looking at where we are now, and working, very hard, long hours on a very large project, but even when we're done, people thought, you need to compartmentalize, you need to not talk about work when it's not work. And the ideas, though, don't find those time periods, right? The ideas come when they come. And so the discussions that we have offline at the end of the day, or, at the grocery store, wherever we are, tend to be just like the most invigorating discussions that lead back into design and the work that we're doing. But so like, the good and the bad news is you kind of can't turn it off, and you've got someone to talk about with that knows what you're talking about intimately. And so I think there's, like, I'd say at this point, like the shorthand that we've developed and how quickly we can move through something is
kind of insane.
We put ourselves to the test very, recently, and it's kind of amazing.
We've always worked with each other, with other people, and it's only been the last couple of years we work only with each other, but with other people outside the office now. And so the time when we're inside the office, that is, we're not on a Zoom call or we're not doing anything else, like I was kind of scared that we could be as productive. We are by far more productive. It is just insane how fast we can get an idea across. And I'm never so confident to know that I'm doing something right. And I think, I rely a lot on Julie's confidence and unbiased opinion. Like, there's not many people that can tell you the truth that you won't be hurt by, and don't have an ulterior motive. So there's definitely some assets to this. There are a lot of partner architects. A lot of them do not work on the same projects together. Like I know maybe one or two others that do. And we've been lucky, and it takes a lot of work. But I don't think I've enjoyed it more than I have in the last couple of years.
Thank you very much. That speaks to the testament of who you guys are and what you're capable and are doing. And so much kudos to you and your success. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Angel has a question.
Yes. Angel, you can unmute yourself and ask.
Stop trucking around.
Angel.
Oh, it's okay.
Can you
Okay.
guys hear me?
Sometimes
Hi.
the hand goes up and you don't really want it.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah,
now
yeah,
we
yeah,
can, now we
sorry.
can.
Oh,
Sorry.
hi. It was a pleasure to meet you guys. My question was, so I enjoyed the fact of like the abstract art in East LA because I'm currently from East LA. I'm by the General Hospital area, and
Yeah.
I've seen that it's a little pizza shop right there across of Mendez High School. That artwork, I've been there before. I enjoy that. I like seeing different forms of art, like from Little Tokyo to different parts of LA. LA is like a melting pot for different cultures, and for me personally, I enjoy like the construction part of it, the seeing the building rise up, seeing what goes into it, from the cement to the rebar to the digging out the dirt to everything like that. I currently worked in construction, so I wanted to get the hands-on experience and also the educational side of it. So, but I can't identify what part of architecture really goes with me. Is there any tips to help find that career? I mean, that path?
Well, that's experimenting and being curious about all of them. Yeah, I mean, it's something that you will, if as you move through this process, you'll spend a lot of time working on different things at different scales with different people, and through that process, you'll learn what it really connects with you. There's kind of no way to know until you kind of jump in and do some of it.
One of the things that might help, especially if you're construction based, that you're already in the making range of things, in the how things are made. You have a kind of not just intuitive, a kind of potentially more background in it than others. There's this quote that I like to bend by Louis Kahn, that where he was supposedly a famous architect who worked a lot with masonry. He asked what a brick what it wanted to be, and it says, "I want to be an arch." And it's like, okay, yeah, that's what most bricks want to be, but what if the brick wants to go out and drag sometime? Or what if the brick wants to be a punk that night? And so sometimes those of you and us that know more about how things are made are able to bend the methods a little bit more and let the brick let its hair down every once in a while. So it doesn't just have to be an arch.
Use your experience to really further form making, as opposed to doing it the standard way that you've seen things done. And I think you're having experience like that is really valuable to other architects. And so I hope that you are able to really use that as you move forward as a way to, a lot of people can graduate from architecture school and not necessarily know how the things go together, and they spend a long time trying to figure that out. So you've got kind of a one-up on everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see it as that. I see it as just trying to stack up my opportunities to getting hired into a better position, in the sense of like, I want to offer more to a company than just, oh, I know how to draw on an iPad. No, I'm not afraid to go out into the field and see what we need to improve on. I'm the type of person that wants to get at it. If you got, like, I just had this conversation with my professor about being, some people are leaders and some people are followers, and I feel like there should be a balance of both. So if my boss tells me, hey, we need this, but it's a little slow, don't worry, boss, I'll go out to the field and I'll see what's happening and I'll report to you. But for me, I get talked on by, I'm the youngest of 4 siblings, so they're telling me like, you gotta stick to one thing. You gotta stick to one thing. You can't be jumping around. You gotta be sure about what you want. So that's what, like, that's why I'm questioning, like, how do I find that path faster so I don't like seem like I'm just wasting money and my time.
No,
I might not give the best advice, but one I'll give you is it is hard. The traditional architectural approach is hard because there's just so much trawling you have to do in your 20s and 30s before you really have enough fish to start heading back to shore. I mean, it just takes a long time, and people think you're wandering around. If you look at a fishing boat, it's just out there wandering around. It's got its net in the water, and it just has to do that. Architecture just takes a long time. It's not a spearfishing exercise. It's net.
I mean, the good thing is I'm 19, so I still got the 20s.
Oh yeah!
Oh
no,
my
yeah,
goodness.
Yeah, I already have 2 years of construction, uni construction under my belt. So I mean, I'm just trying to get at it as much as I can. I appreciate you guys' opinion, and I'm just amazed of the things you guys have done, and I'm proud of you. I'm proud for you guys. keep
Oh,
doing what you
okay.
guys doing and have a good one.
Okay,
Thank
thank
you so
you.
much.
Lucy?
Hi, thank
Hi.
you for being here. Some of us in our design class are working on a community gallery space in Silver Lake, like a
Mhm.
few blocks from your Sunset Triangle project. And
Oh, yeah.
I'd love
Such
I'd
as
love
a
to hear
small
more
feat.
about that project and how it came about and what it was like.
Did you check that one out? Yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No,
Oh, yeah.
I thought it was in here, but it's not, sorry, but.
So that I'm going to try to tell a long story very short. That came to us through county public health, and a woman named Margot Ocanyas, who was working for public health and had done this analysis where one of the best health benefits you could give a community was a park, because it encouraged walking. It did all of these things. It literally, not just for the life of the community, but the health of the residents. And so she was able to earmark some money that was part of a Proposition BB funds or TARP money from county health to develop underutilized streets into temporary parks. And so Sunset Triangle was a pioneer project way back in 2011 or so. It was one of the first prototypical projects to try to reclaim street surfaces for people. In 100 years, streets have become exclusively for cars. But before that, the streets were much more uniformly used. People, dogs, pets, basketball games. There's a reason baseball evolved in a street, or was born in the street. And so that project was she asked us to charrette with almost no money, like literally less than the price of a car to requisition a street. And she ferreted all the bureaucratic headaches and loopholes and everything else to make that happen, and then handed it back to the community. So now anybody in any part of Los Angeles and in other communities in the world, in fact, Barcelona is doing this, Milan is doing it, can approach their, in this case, it's DOT or LA, Los Angeles Department of Street Services, Bureau of Streets, to close a portion of the street. And they'll do an evaluation of whether there's that portion of Sunset Triangle was basically a shortcut and everybody knew it. And so why it was an easy target, that there was a community, but it involved relationships to the business community as well. That there's a place called Morning Lights that used to be one of the businesses on that street that took responsibility for moving the tables in and out every night. But it basically quadrupled, before the pandemic, it quadrupled their seating capacity. So it was good for their business to do this. Nobody made a sacrifice in that. We lost 4 parking spaces, and that was a giant headache at the beginning. And then when we repainted the street in its first maintenance cycle, the community actually kind of freaked out that they thought they were going to lose it. And so they actually came out in support for this. And that process has kind of gained ground throughout. Does that answer any part of your question?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
It's
And
done with
so
paint.
is it temporary? Does it have an end?
No, you have to keep saying the word temporary so people don't get freaked out.
No, but it was a pilot
Okay.
project.
Yeah, but
right?
we proposed it as temporary. In a year, the schedule was to reevaluate to making it permanent. It is now permanent. It is
Great.
and there's this whole process of decommissioning a street where Bureau of Streets is not going to maintain it anymore. It's not a street, so who's going to maintain it? And so the community actually has to get involved to start owning it back. Does it go to parks? Yes, sometimes it does. Bureau of Parks, takes over from Bureau of Streets. It's just a pretty great thing. It reminds me of a Talking Heads song, but whatever.
So if they wanted to, they could take the street part of it out. They could remove the.
Yep. If someone came up with the jackhammer dollars to take out the concrete and
Okay.
or potholing trees, there's a reason there's dots there. It was DOT. But there's also an opportunity to use what they call these core saws to drill, what they use to drill through concrete to put tanks in. You could use to take out the concrete of the street and put a tree in.
Oh, okay, great.
We need a lot of those drills for LA River, Frank.
Yeah.
To take the concrete out and put a tree in.
Yeah. Well, they've done that there's a park, I think in Germany, Neudlingens did it, where it was going to be too much to remove the runway on this old military base. And so what they did is they cross-cut the runway and then let the natural landscape start to break up the runway.
Do the demo.
Yeah.
Do we have more questions while we have them here before we let them go to their night into their evening? When are you guys coming back?
Mid-December.
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 I'm teaching, we're working, on a project in Orange County from here, but because everybody's on Zoom, it makes almost no difference. The schedule's a little weird. And I'm teaching the Milan Politecnico here, which is a pretty.
What project are you guys doing at the school?
It's an adaptive retrofit. It's really funny to work on projects in LA that are 100 years old, of a 600-year-old barn adjacent to an old farm building next to a villa. Not quite a Palladian villa, but the same idea, where there was a main house with a landowner and the wealth came from the cultivation of the land around it. So there's a lot of agricultural infrastructural buildings. And so we're looking at, well, now that there's no agricultural usages for it anymore, what can these lands be used for, and what can the buildings be used for?
I've said this to someone, an architect, don't need to give the name. Like about 20 years ago, I said in the near future, there's going to be a lot of adaptive reuse work all over the world, like what we just said in Italy, for example, because the old functions of the buildings no longer exist, and they are either abandoned or they need to be changed to something. It's like the same thing happening here downtown LA, as you well know. So do you see that it's going to last for a while to adaptive reuse part of things?
Well, Los Angeles is version 1.0 for the most part, and Milan is version 4.0 in some places, and Paris is version 6.0 in some places. So in some ways, LA in its undeveloped land is still in alpha version. So I think this is a long process, but it's consistent with our ideas of maintenance, that wherever you are in the process, you're just handing the stuff off to somebody else. You're an Uber driver basically as an architect.
But in the meantime, it creates incredible potential opportunities. I've been looking at Vernon for a few years now, like 10 years. And it's an amazing amount of transformations that can take place. The LA is full of places like that, the county. But anyway, we can someday we can get together and talk even further.
I got a couch here. You're welcome to come over.
Hey, my style. Okay, guys, thank you so much again, and
my pleasure to get to talk to the homeland. I love that part of the world. I could never live anywhere else.
Great to see you. You're top of my list, people in LA or
holy crap, Saba's here.
Saba is here. I saw her name.
Yeah,
Oh
I spotted.
God.
Where did she go?
Saba, can you say hi at least in person?
Saba, let's hear your voice.
Where are you? Oh my God, Saba. I miss you.
I miss you guys too. Thank you for the chat and the talk.
You're so welcome.
Okay, so
it was a pleasure, and it's such a great program, and anything we can do to help support.
Frank used to come to my reviews at ELAC, and maybe we arrange it again next spring, even you guys are around, maybe both of you to look at some student projects also.
Love to.
Okay, I asked something from every lecturer, so you guys come back to ELAC for reviews. Thank you.
Reviews at Michael's office, right?
Yeah, then why?
You're always asking for something.
I don't know why I'm gonna ask Barbara. I mean,
Yeah, what do we get from Barbara? She's
Yeah,
gonna throw us a party.
Oh, Barbara's a party. Yeah, make sure she hosts.
yes. All right. Okay,
All
thanks
right, okay.
again. We are
Bye,
really
guys.
grateful.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.